She ordered wine, whispered a name, and vanished before the glass was empty. Welcome to McGrath's Casebook. I am your host, Freddie. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. This mystery-loving crew keeps growing. Your messages always make my day. Let's begin. The Riverside Café sat nestled on the edge of the sleepy town of Montclair-sur-Loire, a place where the slow churn of the river seemed to dictate the pace of life. It was an unassuming spot, a quaint little establishment with checkered tablecloths and a view of the water that shimmered under the late afternoon sun. On most days it was a refuge for weary travellers and locals alike, who came for Madame Claire's strong black coffee and her famously tart apple pastries. But on that particular Thursday in October, the café became something else entirely, a scene of inexplicable tragedy. It began with a scream, piercing and raw. It shattered the quiet murmur of conversation and the gentle clink of porcelain cups. Heads turned, chairs scraped against the wooden floor, and a young waitress named Elise dropped a tray of glasses in her shock. The sound had come from the small hallway leading to the café's single restroom, a narrow corridor tucked away behind the kitchen. Madame Claire, a stout woman with a no-nonsense air, was the first to react, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. As she hurried toward the noise, what she found there turned her pale as the linen napkins on her tables. Sighing on the cold tile floor just outside the restroom door was Monsieur Henri Dubois, a regular patron known for his quiet demeanour and his fondness for sitting by the window with a newspaper and a single espresso. His body was unnaturally still, his eyes wide and unseeing, staring at the ceiling as if fixed on some invisible horror. A thin trickle of blood ran from a wound at the base of his skull, pooling beneath his head like spilled ink. But what made Madame Claire gasp wasn't just the sight of death, it was the impossibility of it. The hallway was a dead end, with no windows and only two exits, one leading back to the café's main room, buzzing with witnesses, and the other into the locked restroom, the key for which hung on a hook behind the counter, untouched. Within the hour, the café was swarming with officials, though the local police seemed more baffled than helpful. They cordoned off the area with yellow tape, muttering about how such a thing couldn't have happened in broad daylight, not in a place like this. The dozen or so patrons who had been present at the time of the scream were questioned there. Stories jumbled but consistent in one regard. No one had seen anyone enter or leave that hallway in the moments before or after the scream. Henri Dubois had simply gone to the restroom, as he often did after his second coffee, and then he was gone. By the time Inspector Jules Maigret arrived, summoned from Paris due to the sheer oddity of the case, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the café in a dim, sombre glow. Maigret was a man of unremarkable appearance, middle-aged, broad-shouldered, with a heavy overcoat and a pipe perpetually clenched between his teeth. But there was a sharpness in his grey eyes, a quiet intensity that seemed to see through the surface of things. He stepped into the Riverside Café with a slow, deliberate gait, ignoring the curious stares of the lingering crowd as he made his way to the hallway. The body had been photographed and removed by then, but Maigret insisted on seeing the scene as it had been described. He crouched down where Henri Dubois had fallen, his fingers brushing the now clean tile as if he could feel the echo of violence. He noted the narrowness of the corridor, the locked door to the restroom, and the absence of any obvious weapon. But it wasn't the setting that intrigued him most. It was the single, peculiar clue left behind, tucked into Dubois' clenched fist, as if placed there deliberately, was a small, crumpled ticket stub for a train departing Montclair-sur-Loire to Paris, dated for the following morning. Maigret turned the stub over in his gloved hand, frowning. Dubois was a retired clerk, a man of modest means who hadn't left Montclair in years, according to the locals. Why would he have a ticket for a train he had no reason to take? And more importantly, how had it ended up in his hand after a fatal blow to the head in a hallway with no escape? The ticket felt like a taunt, a piece of nonsense meant to mislead, yet Maigret's instincts told him it was the key to unraveling this puzzle. He stood, slipping the stub into his pocket, and turned to Madame Claire, who hovered nearby, wringing her hands. "Tell me about Monsieur Dubois," he said in his low, measured voice. "Everything you know." She hesitated, then spoke in a rush, as if eager to dispel the weight of the day. Henri Dubois had been coming to the café for nearly a decade, always alone, always at the same time, each afternoon. He was polite but distant, a man who kept to himself. No enemies, no debts, no scandals, at least none that she knew of. Yet there had been something different about him in recent weeks, she admitted. A nervousness in how he glanced over his shoulder, a tremor in his hands when he sipped his coffee. She'd thought nothing of it at the time, chalking it up to age or poor health, but now she wondered. Maigret listened, puffing on his pipe, letting the information settle like sediment in still water. He questioned the other patrons next, piecing together a timeline as tight as a drum. At roughly 3:45 p.m., Dubois had stood from his table by the window, folding his newspaper neatly, as he always did, and walked toward the hallway. Less than 5 minutes later, the scream, later identified as Elise's, who had stumbled upon the body while fetching a broom from a nearby closet. In that brief window, no one had seen anyone else enter or leave the corridor. The kitchen staff, who could see the hallway's entrance from their station, swore they hadn't noticed a soul. It was as if Dubois had been struck down by a ghost. The inspector paced the length of the hallway again, his boots echoing faintly in the now empty café. He tested the restroom door, confirming it was still locked, and examined the key behind the counter. No signs of tampering. He tapped the walls, half expecting to find a hidden panel, but there was nothing. The simplicity of the crime was maddening. A man dead, a single blow to the head, no weapon, no suspect, no way in or out. And that ticket stub, burning a hole in his pocket with its silent mockery. Maigret knew he was dealing with something crafted, deliberate. This wasn't a crime of passion or accident. It was a puzzle meant to stump, to frustrate. He sat at Dubois' usual table by the window, staring out at the river as the last light of day faded, and let his mind wander over the pieces. The ticket stub suggested intent, a journey planned, or perhaps feigned. The locked room, or rather, locked hallway, suggested impossibility, a magician's trick. And the lack of witnesses suggested either incredible luck or meticulous planning. As the night deepened and the café grew colder, Maigret felt a familiar stir, the quiet thrill of a challenge. He didn't yet know who had killed Henri Dubois, or why, but he knew where to start. The ticket stub wasn't random, it was a thread, and he would pull it until the whole tapestry unraveled. For now, though, he simply smoked his pipe and watched the river, letting the mystery breathe around him, knowing that somewhere in this seemingly unsolvable crime lay the truth, waiting to be unearthed. The river outside the Riverside Café glimmered, faintly under the pale moonlight, its surface a restless mirror to Maigret's thoughts as he sat at Henri Dubois' habitual table. The café had emptied out, save for a lone officer stationed at the door, scribbling notes in a worn ledger, and Madame Claire, who hovered near the counter, her face etched with worry. Maigrè's pipe sent thin curls of smoke into the air, blending with the lingering scent of coffee and pastry, but his mind was elsewhere, turning over the ticket stub he'd found in Dubois' hand. It wasn't just a clue, it was a message, though its meaning remained as murky as the river's depths. He rose slowly, his heavy overcoat brushing the edge of the table, and made his way back to the narrow hallway where the crime had occurred. The tiled floor was spotless now, the blood scrubbed away by diligent hands, but Maigret could still picture the scene as it had been described. Dubois sprawled there, eyes wide, the ticket stub clenched in his fist. The local police had done their routine work, photographs, measurements, statements, but they moved with the mechanical efficiency of men who saw no deeper than the surface. Maigret, however, lived for the unseen, the overlooked, the tiny fractures in the facade of the ordinary. He crouched again at the spot where the body had lain, his knees protesting the effort, and let his gaze sweep the hallway with deliberate care. The walls were plain, scuffed here and there from years of use, and the single overhead bulb cast a harsh, clinical light. At first, there was nothing but the locked restroom door at the end and the faint hum of the café beyond the corridor's entrance. But then, as his eyes drifted to the baseboard along the wall, he noticed it. A small, almost imperceptible smudge of reddish-brown, no larger than a thumbprint, just inches from the floor. It could have been rust, or dirt, or even a smear of paint, but Maigret's instincts hummed. He leaned closer, the scent of tobacco clinging to him as he studied it. Blood, he was certain, though likely not enough to belong to the fatal wound. A trace left by something or someone brushing past in haste? He straightened, his mind already tracing possibilities. The smudge was too low to have come from a person's hand or sleeve, unless they'd been crawling, which seemed unlikely. A shoe, perhaps, or something dragged along the wall. He filed the observation away, knowing it was too early to draw conclusions, and turned his attention to the locked restroom. He retrieved the key from behind the counter, ignoring Madame Claire's anxious glance, and returned to slide it into the lock with a faint click. The door creaked open, revealing a cramped utilitarian space, a single sink, a cracked mirror, a narrow window too small for even a child to squeeze through. The room was undisturbed, the tiled floor dry, the trash bin empty. Yet Maigret lingered, his eyes narrowing as they caught a detail the others had missed, a faint, circular imprint in the dust on the sink's edge, as if something small and cylindrical had rested there briefly before being removed. He touched the spot, rubbing the dust between his fingers. A glass? A vial? It was impossible to say, but its presence, or rather, its absence, gnawed at him. Someone had been here, handled something, and taken care to leave no trace. Or so they thought. Maigret stepped back, closing the door with a soft thud, and tucked the key into his pocket for safekeeping. The smudge, the imprint, these were whispers of a presence the police hadn't noticed, and they fueled the quiet certainty growing in his chest. This was no phantom killing. Someone had been in this hallway at the time of Dubois' death, someone who knew how to vanish. He returned to the main room of the café, his boots scuffing lightly against the wooden floor, and cast a slow, appraising look over the space. The local officer was still at the door, oblivious to Maigret's movements, while Madame Claire polished the same spot on the counter for the third time, her nervousness palpable. Maigret approached her, his manner calm but probing, and asked if she'd noticed anything unusual about the restroom in the days leading up to the incident. Strange sounds, unfamiliar patrons lingering, anything at all. She shook her head, her hands trembling slightly as she set down the rag. "No, Inspector. It's just It's always been the same. Cleaned every morning, locked when not in use. I don't understand how this could have happened." Her words were earnest, but Maigret caught the flicker of something in her eyes, a hesitation, a shadow of unease that went beyond the shock of discovering a body in her establishment. He didn't press her, not yet. Instead, he thanked her and turned to the young waitress, Elise, who had been sent home earlier, but returned at Maigret's request. She was barely 20, her pale face framed by a cascade of chestnut hair, and she clutched a handkerchief as if it were a lifeline. Maigret sat across from her at a small table near the window, his voice gentle but firm as he asked her to recount the moment she'd found Dubois. Her story matched what she'd told the police. She'd been fetching a broom from the closet near the hallway when she saw him lying there, the blood pooling beneath his head. She'd screamed, dropped the broom, and run back to the café where others had rushed to see. But as she spoke, Maigret noticed her eyes darting to the side, avoiding his gaze, and her fingers twisting the handkerchief with a ferocity that belied her quiet tone. "Did you see anyone in the hallway before you found him?" he asked, his pipe resting unlit in his hand. "Anyone at all, even for a moment?" "No, no one," she replied too quickly, her voice catching. "It was just empty until I saw him." Maigret nodded, saying nothing, but he noted the way her shoulders tensed, the way her denial felt rehearsed. She was hiding something. Fear, perhaps, or guilt, though whether it was tied to the crime or something personal, he couldn't yet tell. He let her go with a murmur of thanks, watching as she hurried out into the night, her coat pulled tight around her. The first cracks of deception were showing, subtle but undeniable, and Maigret felt the familiar pull of a thread beginning to unravel. He lit his pipe at last, the tobacco's bitter warmth grounding him as he stood by the cafe's window, gazing out at the river once more, the ticket stub in his pocket, the smudge on the baseboard, the imprint on the sink, and now Elise's nervous evasion. These were fragments, disjointed but connected by an invisible design. The local police would continue their routine, chasing fingerprints and alibis, but Maigret knew the truth lay elsewhere, in the small human details they'd overlooked. Someone in Montclair-sur-Loire had orchestrated this impossible crime, and they'd left just enough behind to betray themselves, if only he could piece it together. For now he waited, letting the night stretch on, his mind sifting through the day's observations. The Riverside Café held its secrets close, but Maigret was patient. He would watch and listen, and eventually the facade would slip further. The murderer, whoever they were, had made their first mistake in assuming they could outthink him. And as the river flowed silently outside, Maigret knew he was just getting started. The night deepened around the Riverside Café, the air growing colder as a thin mist rolled in from the river, curling against the windows like ghostly fingers. Inside, the dim light cast long shadows across the checkered tablecloths, and the quiet was broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. Inspector Jules Maigret stood near the window, his pipe sending faint wisps of smoke into the stillness, his mind turning over the fragments of the day. The ticket stub, the smudge of blood on the baseboard, the faint imprint on the restroom sink, and Elise's nervous evasion. They were pieces of a puzzle, each one jagged and incomplete, but together hinting at a larger hidden picture. He knew the truth would not come from physical clues alone. It would emerge from the voices of those tethered to this place, from the stories they told and the secrets they guarded. By the time the clock on the cafe wall ticked past midnight, Maigret had arranged for the key witnesses to return for further questioning. The local police had grumbled at the late hour, but Maigray's calm insistence carried a weight they couldn't ignore. He set up a small table near the counter, as his makeshift interview space, a chipped ceramic ashtray at his elbow for his pipe ash, and a worn notebook where he scribbled occasional notes. One by one, the players in this grim drama shuffled in, their faces weary but wary, each carrying the invisible burden of the day's events. First was Madame Claire, the cafe's owner, whose stout frame seemed to shrink under Maigray's steady gaze as she sat across from him. Her hands, rough from years of kitchen work, fidgeted with the edge of her apron as she recounted her version of the afternoon. She'd been behind the counter at 3:45 p.m., serving a customer, when she saw Henri Dubois rise from his usual table and head toward the hallway. She hadn't thought much of it. Dubois was a creature of habit, after all, and she hadn't noticed anyone follow him. Then came Elise's scream and chaos. Her story aligned with what she'd told him earlier, but Maigret caught the way. Her eyes lingered on the hallway entrance as she spoke, a flicker of something unspoken crossing her face. "You're certain no one else went that way?" he asked, his voice low and measured, his pipe resting unlit in his hand. "Certain, Inspector," she replied, too quickly, her fingers tightening on her apron. "It's a busy time of day, but I would have noticed." Maigret nodded, jotting a note in his book, though his mind was on her eagerness to affirm, her need to seem helpful. She wanted to distance herself from the crime, to prove her innocence, but that very insistence made him wonder what she feared he might uncover. He let her go with a murmur of thanks, watching as she lingered near the counter, pretending to tidy an already spotless shelf. Next came Elise, the young waitress, her pale face even more drawn in the stark light of the cafe. She sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her handkerchief now a crumpled ball in her grip. Her story hadn't changed. She'd been fetching a broom from the closet when she saw Dubois on the floor, screamed, and ran back to summon help. But as Maigret pressed her on the moments before, asking if she'd seen anyone near the hallway or heard any odd sound, her answers grew shorter, her gaze skittering away from his. "No, nothing. I was just walking, and then I saw him, that's all." "And the broom," Maigret said, tilting his head slightly. "Where is it now?" She blinked, caught off guard. I don't know. I dropped it, I think." "Someone must have picked it up." Maigret made another note, his expression unreadable. The broom wasn't important in itself, but her uncertainty, her sudden fluster, was. She was holding something back, perhaps out of fear or confusion, and he sensed it wasn't the whole truth of what she'd seen. He dismissed her gently, noting how she hurried to the door, glancing back at him as if expecting to be called again. The kitchen staff followed, a burly cook named Pierre and a scrawny dishwasher, Michel, both of whom claimed to have been at their posts during the critical minutes. Pierre, wiping sweat from his brow with a stained towel, insisted he'd been chopping vegetables with a clear view of the hallway entrance and saw no one but Dubois go in. Michel, barely out of his teens, mumbled that he'd been scrubbing pots, his back to the cafe, and hadn't noticed a thing until the scream. Yet there was a contradiction in their timing. Pierre said the scream came just as he'd finished with a batch of onions around 3:50 p.m., while Michel swore it was closer to 3:45 before he'd even started on the last sink full of dishes. It was a small inconsistency easily chalked up to human error, but Maigret's pen scratched it into his notebook. Small lies often hid larger ones. Then there was Monsieur Lambert, an elderly regular who'd been sitting 2 tables away from Dubois that afternoon. He was a wiry man with a shock of white hair and a tremor in his hands, and he spoke with a slow, deliberate cadence, as if weighing each word. He claimed to have seen Dubois stand and walk to the hallway, nothing unusual, and then heard the scream shortly after. But when Maigret asked if he'd noticed Dubois' demeanour in the days prior, Madame Claire had mentioned a nervousness. Lambert's response was oddly sharp. Nervous? No, Inspector. Henri was always the same. Quiet, steady. Whoever told you otherwise is imagining things. Maigret raised an eyebrow, sensing the defensiveness beneath the words. Lambert was quick to dismiss, quicker still to shift the conversation, asking if the police had any leads yet, if they thought it was a robbery gone wrong. The questions felt like a shield, a way to redirect rather than answer. Maigret thanked him, his tone neutral, but in his mind he marked Lambert as someone with more to say, if only he could be pressed at the right moment. As the interviews stretched into the early hours, Maigret lit his pipe again, the tobacco's bitter warmth, a counterpoint to the chill creeping through the cafe's windows. Each witness had painted a slightly different picture, their stories overlapping, but fraying at the edges with contradictions and hesitations. Madame Claire's over-eagerness, Elise's evasiveness, the kitchen staff's mismatched timelines, Lambert's subtle deflection, they were all threads of deception, woven into a tapestry of half-truths. Maigret knew that hidden motives simmered beneath their words, though whether they stemmed from guilt, fear, or something else, he couldn't yet say. He leaned back in his chair, gazing out at the river's misty expanse, the ticket stub still, a weight in his pocket. The voices of the Riverside Café were speaking, even if they didn't know it, and Maigret was listening. Each contradiction, each nervous glance, was a step closer to the truth of Henri Dubois' death. The night was far from over, and he had the patience of a man who knew that secrets, like river currents, always surfaced in time. The morning mist clung to the banks of the river outside the Riverside Café, softening the outlines of Montclair-sur-Loire as the town stirred to life. Inside, Inspector Jules Maigret stood near the window, his heavy overcoat draped over a chair, his pipe sending faint curls of smoke into the cool air. The tangle of motives, Madame Claire's financial woes, Elise's secretive fear, Pierre and Michel's proximity, Lambert's buried grudges, still churned in his mind, a web of possibilities with no clear center. He'd spent the early hours piecing together alibis and connections, but the heart of Henri Dubois' murder remained elusive, hidden behind the ticket stub in his pocket and the impossible nature of the crime. As the café began to fill with the murmur of early patrons, Maigret sensed the investigation was about to shift, though whether toward truth or illusion he couldn't yet say. It was just past 8 a.m. when the local police sergeant, a wiry man named Fournier, with a penchant for quick conclusions, burst through the café door, his face flushed with triumph. He clutched a small, sealed evidence bag in one hand, his boots scuffing the wooden floor as he made a beeline for Maigret. "Inspector, we've got it," he declared, his voice loud enough to turn heads among the scattered customers. "The weapon, or close enough. Found it not 20 minutes ago. This wraps it up, I'd wager." Maigret turned slowly, his grey eyes narrowing as he took the bag from Fournier's eager grip. Inside was a heavy brass candlestick, its base crusted with a dark, flaky residue that could only be dried blood. The weight of it felt right for a fatal blow, the kind that could have struck Dubois at the base of the skull with lethal precision. Fournier explained, barely containing his excitement, that a patrol officer had discovered it hidden in a dumpster behind the café, wrapped in a rag and tucked beneath a pile of kitchen refuse. "It's got to be what did him in," Fournier insisted, "and we've got prints on it. Partial, but enough to run. I've already sent them to the lab in Paris. We'll have a match by afternoon, mark my words. Maigret held the candlestick up to the light, turning it carefully, noting the ornate design etched into its stem. A match for the decor on some of the cafe's tables, a detail Madame Claire might use for ambiance on quieter nights. The blood was undeniable, smeared near the base where it would have made contact with a skull. It seemed a perfect fit, a breakthrough that could tie the crime scene to a tangible act of violence. Fournier was already spinning a narrative, pacing as he spoke. Likely Pierre, the cook, always had a temper, and he was closest to the hallway. Grabbed this from a table, followed Dubois, struck him quick, then ditched it out back before anyone noticed. Kitchen staff always use that dumpster. It's open and shut. By midday, the news had spread through the local force like wildfire. Fournier and his men were buzzing, drawing up arrest warrants and preparing statements for the press, convinced they'd cracked the case less than 24 hours after the murder. They'd even pulled Pierre in for questioning again, his burly frame sweating under the glare of the station's lights as he stammered denials. The partial prints, rushed through the lab with modern efficiency, came back as a tentative match to his, faint, smudged, but enough for Fournier to crow about a conviction. The candlestick was sent for further testing, but to the sergeant, the evidence was airtight. We've got motive, those arguments with Dubois, and opportunity with him steps from the hallway, Fournier told Maigret over a hurried lunch of stale bread and cheese at the café. Give it a day, Inspector. Paris will sign off, and... We'll have him booked. Maigret listened, his face a mask of quiet contemplation, puffing on his pipe as he stared out at the river through the café's window. The candlestick was compelling. He couldn't deny it. The blood, the weight, the proximity to the crime scene, it all pointed to a blunt, opportunistic attack. Pierre's temper and inconsistent timeline with Michel added fuel to the theory. He could have slipped away for a moment, struck Dubois in a flash of rage, and hidden the weapon before rejoining the kitchen chaos. Even the smudge of blood on the baseboard in the hallway could fit, a stray mark from a hurried escape. Fournier's men toasted their early victory, with cheap wine at a corner table, their voices brash with certainty, while Maigret felt a nagging unease settle in his chest like a stone. Something didn't sit right. He turned the puzzle over in his mind, tracing the edges of this so-called breakthrough. The candlestick's discovery felt too neat, too convenient, unearthed mere hours after a crime that had seemed meticulously planned down to its impossible setting. Why would a killer, clever enough to strike in a locked hallway with no witnesses, be so careless as to dump the weapon in a dumpster steps from the scene? And the ticket stub clutched in Dubois' hand. Fournier dismissed it as irrelevant, a random keepsake, but Maigret knew it was deliberate, a message that didn't align with a spontaneous act of violence by a temperamental cook. Pierre's prints, too, were only partial, easily explained by his handling of café items during routine work. The more Maigret considered it, the more the candlestick felt like a lure, a distraction dangled to divert attention from a deeper truth. He rose, slipping the ticket stub from his pocket to study it again under the harsh light of the café. A train to Paris, dated for the following morning after Dubois' death. It suggested intent, a journey planned or prevented, and it gnawed at Maigret's instincts. If Pierre was the killer, driven by a petty grudge, why the stub? Why the precision of a crime that left no immediate suspect? Maigret's gaze drifted to the hallway entrance, where the memory of Dubois' body lingered like a ghost. The faint imprint on the restroom sink, the nervous glances of Elise, the defensiveness of Lambert, none of these fit into Fournier's tidy conclusion. The real criminal, Maigret suspected, was watching from the shadows, counting on this false victory to bury their tracks. As the afternoon wore on, Fournier pushed forward with his case, hauling Pierre to the station for a formal charge, while the local press scribbled sensational headlines about the Riverside murder solved. Maigret, however, lingered at the café, ignoring the sergeant's insistence that he join the celebration. He sat at Dubois' usual table by the window, his coffee cold, his notebook open to a blank page. The river flowed outside, indifferent to the rush of human error, and Maigret felt the weight of unseen eyes upon him. Someone in Montclair-sur-Loire had crafted this illusion, planted the candlestick as a scapegoat, and now waited, poised for the moment the spotlight dimmed. They underestimated him, though. Maigret's patience was his weapon, sharper than any brass bludgeon, and he would wait as long as it took for the true killer to betray themselves. He lit his pipe, the tobacco's bitter warmth steadying his resolve, and watched the river's ceaseless current. The false victory was a mirage, a distraction meant to close the case, but Maigret saw through it. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun. And somewhere in the quiet corners of this town, the real criminals stirred, unaware that the inspector's gaze was already turning their way. The late afternoon sun hung low over Montclair-sur-Loire, casting long shadows across the river's surface as it rippled outside the Riverside Café. Inside, Inspector Jules Maigret sat at Henri Dubois' usual table by the window, the clamour of the local police's premature celebration fading into a distant hum. The brass candlestick, hailed as the murder weapon, had led Sergeant Fournier and his men to charge Pierre, the temperamental cook, but Maigret's unease gnawed at him like a persistent ache. The candlestick was too convenient, the conclusion too neat, for a crime so meticulously staged. The ticket stub to Paris, still, tucked in his pocket, whispered of deeper intent, and Maigret knew the truth lay beyond the surface of Fournier's false victory. As he sipped the last of his cold coffee, his mind turned over the fragments of the case, searching for the overlooked piece that would shift the puzzle into focus. He pulled out his notebook, flipping through the scrawled observations from the past day and a half, the blood smudge on the baseboard, the faint imprint on the restroom sink, the nervous ticks of witnesses like Elise and Lambert. None of it aligned with Pierre as the sole culprit, driven by a fleeting rage. Maigret's gaze drifted to the river, its ceaseless flow a mirror to his thoughts, and settled on a hunch that had been simmering since the interviews. The past, he sensed, held the key. Dubois wasn't just a quiet retiree, he carried a history, and in a small town like this, history rarely stayed buried. Maigret rose, slipping on his heavy overcoat, and made his way to the local police station, a squat brick building a few streets over from the café. Fournier was preoccupied, barking orders to finalize Pierre's paperwork, which suited Maigret fine. He waved off the sergeant's invitation to join the proceedings and instead requested access to the station's meagre archive of old case files. The desk clerk, a bored young man with ink-stained fingers, shrugged and led him to a dusty basement room lined with sagging shelves. "Not much here, Inspector," the clerk muttered. "Mostly petty thefts and bar fights. What are you looking for?" "Anything on Henri Dubois," Maigret replied, his voice low and deliberate. "Or anyone tied to him. Go back as far as you can." The clerk sighed but complied, dragging out crumbling ledgers and faded folders while Maigret lit his pipe, the tobacco's familiar bitterness grounding him in the musty gloom. Hours slipped by as he sifted through yellowed pages, his fingers smudged with dust. Most of it was mundane, lost livestock, property disputes. But then, buried in a file from nearly 30 years ago, he found it. A report on a mill accident. Along the river, dated 1898, Henri Dubois, then a young clerk at the mill, had been a witness to a fatal mishap. A worker named Edouard Lambert, undoubtedly related to Monsieur Lambert, the elderly regular, had died when machinery malfunctioned, crushed under a collapsed beam. The incident was ruled an accident, but the report noted whispers of negligence, even sabotage, though no charges were filed. Dubois' statement was curt, claiming he'd seen nothing unusual, but a handwritten note scrawled in the margin by the investigating officer hinted at doubt. Witnesses evasive, possible cover-up, lack of evidence. Maigrè's pulse quickened as he read, the pipe forgotten in his hand. Edouard Lambert's death tied directly to Monsieur Lambert, who'd known Dubois for decades, and whose defensiveness during questioning now took on a sharper edge. Had an old grudge festered into revenge? Maigré cross-referenced the names in the file, discovering that another figure mentioned as a minor witness was Claire Beaumont, likely Madame Claire, before her marriage. 3 names, Dubois, Lambert, and Claire, linked by a tragedy from decades past, a shadow that might explain the present violence. The Riverside Café wasn't just a crime scene, it was a stage for history's unresolved debts. He tucked the file under his arm and returned to the café as evening fell, the sky bruising purple over the river. Madame Claire was behind the counter, her face tense as she served a sparse crowd, and Maigré settled at a quiet table to watch her. When she brought him a fresh coffee, he asked casually about her early years in Montclair-sur-Loire, mentioning the mill in passing. Her hand faltered, a tremor spilling a drop of coffee onto the saucer, and her voice was tight as she answered, "That was a lifetime ago, Inspector. I was just a girl, working odd jobs. Terrible, what happened there. But it's long forgotten." Her words were clipped, her eyes avoiding his, and Maigré noted the lie in her forced dismissal. She remembered, and it weighed on her. He thanked her, letting the silence stretch as she retreated, then turned his attention to Monsieur Lambert, who sat at his usual spot 2 tables away, nursing a glass of wine. Maigré approached, his gait slow and unthreatening, and took a seat opposite the old man. "A word, Monsieur Lambert," he began, his tone conversational. "About the mill accident. Edouard was your brother, wasn't he?" Lambert's hand tightened around his glass, his weathered face hardening, though he didn't deny it. "What of it?" he snapped. "That's ancient history, nothing to do with today." "Perhaps," Maigré said, puffing on his pipe. "But history has a way of lingering. You and Dubois were there, so was Claire. And now Dubois is dead in a way that feels personal. Care to tell me why?" Lambert's jaw clenched, his eyes flickering with something between anger and fear. But he held his tongue, muttering only that he had nothing to hide. Maigré didn't push, not yet. He returned to his table, the pieces shifting in his mind. The mill accident connected Dubois, Lambert, and Claire in a triangle of shared trauma, perhaps guilt, perhaps blame. Had Dubois known something damning, a secret buried for decades that surfaced with deadly consequences? The ticket stub to Paris might have been his plan to flee, to escape a truth catching up with him. As night enveloped the café, Maigré stared at the river's dark expanse, the weight of the past settling over him. The crime wasn't just about greed or a petty argument, it was rooted in a forgotten tragedy, a hidden connection that bound the suspects in ways even they might not fully grasp. Lambert's resentment, Claire's fear, they stemmed from something deeper than the present, a shadow from 1898 that had stretched across time to claim Dubois' life. But who had wielded the final blow, and why now? Maigré knew he was closer, the web tightening, but the full shape of the truth remained just out of reach. He lit his pipe again, the smoke curling like ghosts in the dim light, and resolved to dig deeper into the mill accident, witnesses, rumors, anything that might unearth the buried motive. The real killer, still cloaked in shadow, believed the past could protect them, that Fournier's rush to blame Pierre would close the case. But Maigret saw through the illusion. The roots of this murder stretched back 30 years, and he would follow them, step by patient step, until the shadows of history revealed their secrets. The night wrapped Montclair-sur-Loire in a quiet chill. The river outside the Riverside Café, a dark ribbon under the faint glow of street lamps. Inside, Inspector Jules Maigret sat at his now familiar table by the window, the weight of the day's discoveries pressing down on him like the damp air. The old mill accident from 1898 had emerged as a silent undercurrent to Henri Dubois' murder, tying together Madame Claire, Monsieur Lambert, and the victim in a web of shared history, perhaps guilt, perhaps blame. But the motive still eluded him, a shadow just beyond reach, and the ticket stub to Paris in his pocket remained a cryptic taunt. Maigret knew conventional methods, interviews, alibis, evidence had taken him as far as they could. To pierce the veil of deception, he needed something unconventional, a tactic to unsettle the carefully guarded facades of those around him. He sipped the last of a lukewarm coffee, his pipe resting unlit in his hand, and considered his next move. The local police, led by Sergeant Fournier, were still fixated on Pierre, the cook, as their prime suspect, convinced the brass candlestick closed the case. Maigret, however, saw through the distraction. The real killer was among the cafe's familiar faces, hiding behind decades-old secrets and rehearsed lies. To draw them out, he decided on a psychological gambit, a staged scenario designed to provoke, to tease out a reaction that might betray hidden truths. It was a risk, but Maigret thrived on the subtle art of human nature, where a single flinch could speak louder than a confession. The following morning, as the café bustled with its early crowd, Maigret gathered the key players, Madame Claire, Elise, Monsieur Lambert, and even Pierre, who'd been released on tenuous bail pending further forensic results on the candlestick. He'd arranged for them to meet under the pretense of a final clarification of timelines, a routine request to satisfy Paris bureaucracy. They sat at a cluster of tables near the counter, their faces a mix of wariness and resignation, while Maigret stood before them, his heavy overcoat draped over a chair, his manner deceptively casual. "Thank you for indulging me," he began, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority. "There's one last detail to settle, a minor discrepancy about the moments before Monsieur Dubois' death. I've found something curious and I'd like your thoughts." From his pocket, he produced not the ticket stub, as they might have expected, but a small, worn ledger, one he'd borrowed from the police archives, unrelated to the case, but doctored overnight with a few strategic additions in his own hand. He opened it to a marked page, pretending to scan the contents, though he knew exactly what he'd written. "This record," he said, glancing around the circle, "mentions a meeting scheduled here at the café on the afternoon of the murder. A meeting involving Monsieur Dubois and, well, it's not entirely clear who else. The note suggests it was about a debt tied to an old matter from decades past. Curious, isn't it, that no one mentioned this?" The room stilled, the clatter of cups and murmured chatter from other patrons fading into the background. Maigret watched their faces with the keenness of a hawk, noting every shift, every flicker of unease. Madame Claire's hands tightened on the edge of the counter behind her, her lips pressing into a thin line, though she said nothing. Elise, seated near the window, dropped her gaze to her lap, her fingers twisting nervously at her apron. Pierre scowled, muttering something about not knowing anything, while Lambert, his wiry frame rigid, stared at Maigret with a hardness that bordered on defiance. "What are you implying, Inspector?" Lambert asked sharply. "Dubois and I hadn't spoken of debts or meetings in years. That ledger's nonsense." "Perhaps," Maigret replied, closing the book with a deliberate snap, his eyes never leaving Lambert's. "But memories can be selective. I thought one of you might recall something, anything about this meeting, or about why Dubois might have been planning to leave for Paris the next day." He let the mention of Paris hang in the air, a subtle nod to the ticket stub, watching for a reaction. It came, fleeting but unmistakable, not from Lambert, but from Elise. Her head snapped up at the word Paris, her pale face draining of what little colour it had, her eyes wide for a split second before she forced them down again. Her hands, still clutching her apron, trembled visibly, and she shifted in her chair as if the seat had grown uncomfortably hot. Maigret caught it all in an instant, the crack in her fragile composure, a sign of something buried deep, fear, guilt, or knowledge she couldn't contain. The others reacted too, in subtler ways, Claire's forced cough, Lambert's tightened jaw, but Elise's response was raw, unguarded, a window into a truth she'd struggled to hide. He didn't press her directly, not yet. Instead, he shifted the conversation, asking mundane questions about the cafe's routine that day, letting the tension dissipate while he filed away Elise's reaction. The ledger ploy had worked, not in confirming a non-existent meeting, but in rattling the suspects, exposing nerves frayed by secrets. Elise knew something about Paris, about Dubois' intended journey, and it terrified her. Was she protecting someone, or had she played a role herself? Maigret's mind turned over the mill accident of 1898, the shadow linking Dubois, Claire, and Lambert, and wondered if Elise, though too young to have been there, was caught in its aftermath. A family connection, perhaps, or a secret passed down. As the group dispersed, Maigret lingered at his table, lighting his pipe at last, the tobacco's bitter warmth steadying his thoughts. He watched Elise hurry to clear dishes, her movements jerky, avoiding his gaze. The unconventional tactic had borne fruit. Her reaction was a subtle crack in the wall of deception surrounding the cafe, a glimpse of the vulnerability beneath. But it also deepened the mystery. What tied a young waitress to a decades-old tragedy and a murdered man's escape plan? Was she a pawn, a witness, or something more? Outside, the river flowed on, indifferent to the human drama unfolding in its shadow, and Maigret felt the puzzle shift once more. The ticket stub, the mill accident, and now Elise's unguarded fear. They were threads in a tapestry of hidden truths, weaving tighter with each passing hour. He knew he was closer, the killer's silhouette emerging from the fog of the past, but the full picture remained just out of reach. Elise's reaction was a step forward, a signpost to follow, and Maigret resolved to trace it gently, patiently, until it led him to the heart of the crime. He puffed on his pipe, gazing at the river's dark expanse as the cafe hummed around him. The unconventional clue had worked its magic, stirring the still waters of deception, and now the ripples were spreading. The killer, still cloaked in shadow, might believe they were safe, but Maigret was watching, waiting for the next slip, the next crack to reveal them. The game of cat and mouse had intensified, and he was ready for the chase. The late morning light filtered through the windows of the Riverside Café, painting faint patterns on the checkered tablecloths as Montclair-sur-Loire hummed with its usual rhythm outside. Inspector Jules Maigret sat at his customary spot by the window, the river's steady flow a quiet counterpoint to the storm of thoughts in his mind. The psychological gambit with the doctored ledger had paid off, cracking open Elise's carefully guarded demeanor with a fleeting but telling reaction to the mention of Paris. Her fear, tied to the ticket stub in Dubois' hand, was a thread Maigret intended to follow, weaving it with the shadows of the 1898 mill accident that bound Madame, Claire, Monsieur Lambert, and the victim in a decades-old secret. The case was gaining momentum, the puzzle pieces shifting into a clearer, if still incomplete, shape. But as he lit his pipe, the tobacco's familiar bitterness grounding him, Maigret felt a prickle of unease, a sense that the ground beneath him was about to shift. He had planned to spend the day delving deeper into Elise's connection, starting with a discreet inquiry into her family history for ties to the mill or Dubois. The ticket stub, still tucked safely in his coat pocket, was his anchor, a tangible link to the motive he sought. But before he could rise to begin his rounds, Sergeant Fournier strode into the café, his face a storm of frustration rather than the triumph of the previous day. "Inspector," he barked, drawing curious glances from nearby patrons. "We've got a problem, a big one. You better come to the station." Maigret followed without a word, his heavy overcoat slung over his arm, sensing the urgency in Fournier's clipped tone. At the small police station, the air was thick with tension, officers muttering among themselves as they shuffled papers and avoided eye contact. Fournier led him to the evidence room, a cramped space lined with metal shelves and locked cabinets, and pointed to an empty spot on a table where a labelled bag should have sat. "The candlestick," Fournier growled, his hands on his hips. "Gone. Vanished sometime between last night and this morning. We had it secured here after the prince came back, waiting for further blood analysis from Paris. Now it's just poof. Someone got in, bypassed the lock, and took it. No sign of forced entry either." Maigret's grey eyes narrowed as he surveyed the room, noting the undisturbed cabinets and the logbook on a nearby desk, its latest entry showing the candlestick checked in at 9 p.m. the previous evening. The loss of the candlestick, though he doubted its role as the true murder weapon, was a blow not for its evidentiary value, but for what its disappearance revealed. Someone was working against the investigation, desperate to bury the truth before it surfaced. The candlestick had been Fournier's linchpin in charging Pierre, a distraction from the deeper motive Maigret pursued, and its theft suggested the real killer or their ally feared even a flawed piece of evidence might point in the wrong direction if scrutinized too closely. "Who had access?" Maigret asked, his voice calm but edged with steel as he turned to Fournier. "Keys, codes, anything?" Fournier scrubbed a hand through his thinning hair, pacing the small room. "Only a handful of us. Me, 2 senior officers, and the desk clerk, who logs evidence. The locks are standard, no fancy security in a town this small, but the door wasn't tampered with. Whoever did this knew what they were after and how to get in. I've got my men questioning everyone who was on duty last night, but—" He trailed off, his frustration palpable. "This makes us look like fools, Inspector, and it guts the case against Pierre. Without the candlestick, the prints are just circumstantial." Maigret nodded, though his mind was elsewhere, tracing the implications. The theft wasn't random. It was a calculated strike, timed just as he'd begun to unravel threads linking the past to the present. The killer, or someone protecting them, had access, or influence, within the station itself. A chilling thought that eroded the fragile trust he'd placed in the local force. Was it an inside job, an officer turning a blind eye for a bribe, or out of fear? Or had someone from the café's circle, Claire, Lambert, Elise, exploited a connection to slip in unnoticed? The stakes had risen sharply. This wasn't just a murder investigation anymore, but a race against an unseen hand working to sabotage every step forward. He returned to the cafe after a fruitless hour at the station, where interrogations of the night staff yielded only shrugs and denials. Settling at his table, Maigret pulled out his notebook, jotting down the new development alongside his observations of Elise's reaction to Paris. The ticket stub, he confirmed with a quick pat of his pocket, was still secure, though the thought of it too, vanishing, sent a chill down his spine. He ordered a fresh coffee from a subdued Madame Claire, watching her closely as she moved behind the counter. Her hands were steady, but her eyes darted to the door more often than necessary, as if expecting or dreading something. Did she know about the theft? Had she orchestrated it to protect herself or another? Maigret's gaze shifted to Elise, clearing tables near the window, her movement still jittery after the ledger gambit. Then to Lambert, hunched over his wine at his usual spot, his weathered face unreadable. Even Pierre, back in the kitchen despite the charges, could be seen through the pass-through, his expression grim as he chopped vegetables with unnecessary force. Each of them had motive, opportunity, or both to meddle with the evidence. And Maigret felt the weight of their unseen alliances pressing in. Trust, already tenuous in a town bound by old secrets, had become a fragile, brittle thing, liable to shatter at the slightest misstep. As evening approached, the cafe's dim light, casting long shadows across the floor, Maigret lit his pipe and stared out at the river, its surface now a mirror to the darkening sky. The vanishing candlestick was a bold move, a warning that the killer or their protector would stop at nothing to keep the truth buried. It confirmed his suspicion that the candlestick was a plant, meant to mislead, and its theft was a desperate act to prevent further analysis from exposing the ruse. But it also narrowed the field. Only someone deeply invested in the case, with intimate knowledge of the investigation, could have pulled it off. The river flowed on, indifferent to the mounting danger, and Maigret felt the noose of the case tighten. He would guard the remaining clues, especially the ticket stub, with his life, knowing they were targets now. The stakes had never been higher, and the unseen enemy had shown their hand, if only briefly. Maigret's resolve hardened. Whoever had stolen the evidence believed they could outmaneuver him, but he was patient, relentless. He would rebuild trust where he could, watch every move, and wait for the next slip. The truth of Henri Dubois' murder was closer than ever, hidden behind a wall of sabotage, but Maigret would tear it down, brick by brick, until the killer stood exposed in the light. The evening deepened over Montclair-sur-Loire, the river, outside the Riverside Café shimmering faintly under the glow of sparse street lamps. Inside, Inspector Jules Maigret sat at his familiar table by the window, the bitter scent of tobacco from his pipe mingling with the fading aroma of coffee. The theft of the brass candlestick from the police station had shaken the investigation, a bold move by an unseen hand, desperate to bury the truth of Henri Dubois' murder. Trust had eroded into a brittle thread, and Maigret knew the killer, or their protector, was closer than ever, watching his every move. The ticket stub to Paris, still secure in his pocket, felt like a lifeline, a clue he guarded with renewed vigilance. As he scribbled notes on Elise's reaction to his psychological gambit and the lingering shadow of the 1898 mill accident, he sensed the case teetering on the edge of a precipice, poised for a shift he couldn't yet predict. It was nearing 9 p.m., the cafe thinning out as the last patrons finished their drinks when the door burst open with a jarring clang. A young officer from the local station, his face pale and slick with sweat, stumbled in, his uniform askew. "Inspector Maigret," he gasped, drawing the attention of the remaining customers and a startled Madame Claire behind the counter. "You're needed. Now. It's It's Elise. She's gone, disappeared. No one's seen her since late afternoon. Maigret rose slowly, his pipe forgotten on the table, the weight of the words sinking in as he fixed the officer with a steady gaze. "Explain," he said, his voice low but commanding, pulling on his heavy overcoat as he moved toward the door. The officer, still catching his breath, recounted the scant details as they hurried toward the station. Elise, the young waitress, whose nervous reaction to Paris had flagged Maigret's suspicion, had last been seen leaving the café around 4 p.m., muttering about an errand. She hadn't returned for her evening shift, which Madame Claire found odd, but not alarming until hours passed with no word. A concerned neighbor who often saw Elise walking home along the river path reported she never reached her small rented room above the town bakery. A quick search by local officers turned up nothing. No witnesses, no signs of struggle, just an empty silence where Elise should have been. "We're combing the streets now," the officer added, his voice tight. "But with everything else, the murder, the stolen evidence, it feels connected." Maigret's jaw tightened as they reached the station, the dim lights casting harsh shadows across the cluttered desks. The disappearance of Elise was no mere coincidence. It was a sharp, unexpected twist, a second crime that jolted the investigation into a new, dangerous direction. His mind raced over the implications. Elise had known something. Her trembling reaction to the ticket stub's implication proved it, and her vanishing act suggested either she'd fled out of fear or been silenced by someone who feared what she might reveal. The killer, still several steps ahead, wasn't just covering tracks but actively reshaping the battlefield, ensuring the truth remained buried. Maigret now faced not only the task of solving Dubois' murder, but the urgent need to prevent another tragedy, if it wasn't already too late. Inside the station, Sergeant Fournier was barking orders to a handful of officers, organizing a wider search along the river and into the wooded paths beyond town. His face, flushed with frustration, turned to Maigret with a mix of irritation and deference. "Another mess on our hands, Inspector," he muttered. "First the candlestick, now this. If the girl's tied to Dubois' death, her disappearance could blow the case wide open or sink it entirely. What do you make of it?" Maigret didn't answer immediately, his grey eyes scanning the room as if the answer might lie in the mundane clutter of paperwork and coffee mugs. He lit his pipe, the ritual steadying him, and considered the stakes. Elise's disappearance confirmed his suspicion that the killer operated with chilling precision, striking at vulnerabilities to maintain control. If she'd been taken, it meant the murderer knew Maigret was closing in, likely through his probing at the café and the psychological ploy with the ledger. If she'd run, her fear of the killer or of exposure pointed to a secret so damning it could unravel everything. Either way, the investigation had turned into a race against time, with a shadowy adversary pulling strings from the darkness. He turned to Fournier, his voice measured but firm. "Double the search along the river path. Check every alley, every shed she might be hiding, or worse, and discreetly pull her personal records. Family, friends, any ties to Dubois or the old mill. I need to know what she was afraid of." Fournier nodded, though his expression betrayed doubt, and Maigret stepped outside into the cool night air, needing the solitude to think. The river stretched before him, its surface a mirror to the black sky, and Maigret felt the weight of the dual crimes pressing down. Dubois' murder was no longer a solitary puzzle, it was part of a larger, more dangerous game. The stolen candlestick had been a warning, but Elise's disappearance was an escalation, proof that the villain would stop at nothing to protect their secret. Was it Madame Claire, her financial desperation masking a deeper motive tied to the mill accident? Monsieur Lambert harboring a decades-old grudge, or someone else lurking unseen, manipulating events with ruthless cunning? Maigrè's hand brushed the ticket stub in his pocket, its edges worn from handling, a reminder of the thread tying Dubois to Paris, and perhaps to Elise's fear. He resolved to retrace her last known steps himself, starting at dawn along the river path, searching for any sign, a dropped item, a witness overlooked, that might reveal whether she'd fled or been taken. He also planned to press harder into the past, digging for records of Elise's family to uncover any connection to the 1898 tragedy that haunted the case. The killer had struck again, indirectly or not, and Maigret knew the clock was ticking toward another act of violence if he didn't act swiftly. As the night deepened, he returned to the café briefly to retrieve his notebook, ignoring the curious stares of the lone late patron and Madame Claire's anxious hovering. Her eyes followed him, and he noted the strain in her posture. Did she know more about Elise than she let on? Trust, already fractured by the stolen evidence, was now a luxury he couldn't afford. The river outside flowed on, indifferent to the mounting danger, and Maigret felt the investigation pivot beneath him, sharper and more perilous than ever. He lit his pipe once more, the smoke curling like a shroud in the dim light, and steeled himself for the challenges ahead. The unexpected twist of Elise's disappearance had raised the stakes to a deadly height. He wasn't just solving a crime now, but fighting to outpace a villain who played a ruthless game. The killer believed they held all the cards, but Maigret's patience was his weapon, honed by years of unraveling the impossible. He would find Elise, alive or not, and through her, the truth of Dubois' death. The chase had intensified, and he was ready to match every step of the shadow ahead until it stumbled into the light. The first faint light of dawn crept over Montclair-sur-Loire, casting a ghostly sheen across the river outside the Riverside Café. Inspector Jules Maigret stood alone on the narrow path along the water's edge, his heavy overcoat pulled tight against the morning chill, his pipe unlit in his hand. The unexpected disappearance of Elise, the young waitress whose fear had betrayed a hidden connection to Henri Dubois' murder, had thrust the investigation into a desperate new phase. The stolen candlestick, the escalating actions of an unseen killer, and now this second crime, whether flight or abduction, had heightened the stakes to a razor's edge. Maigret had spent the night coordinating with Sergeant Fournier's men, organizing searches along the river and into the town's shadowed corners, but as the sky lightened, he knew brute effort alone wouldn't uncover the truth. He needed to see the pattern beneath the chaos, the thread that tied Dubois' death to Elise's vanishing, and the secrets of the past. He walked the river path slowly, retracing Elise's last known route from the café to her rented room above. The bakery, his grey eyes scanning every detail, trampled grass, stray pebbles, the faintest scuff of a footprint in the damp earth. Nothing stood out at first. The path was well trodden, used by townsfolk daily, and the local police had already combed it without success. But Maigret's method was patience, a quiet observation of the overlooked, and as he neared a bend where the river widened, something caught his attention. A small, crumpled piece of paper, half buried under a tuft of weeds, glinted in the weak sunlight. He crouched, his knees protesting, and carefully plucked it free. It was a torn fragment of a receipt, faded but legible, stamped with the logo of a Paris-bound train line, dated for the day after Dubois' murder, the same date as the ticket stub in his pocket. The discovery sent a jolt through him, though his face remained impassive. It wasn't definitive proof of Elise's fate, but its presence here, on her presumed path, suggested a connection too precise to be coincidence. Had she dropped it in haste, fleeing something or someone? Or had it been planted, a taunt, by the killer mirroring the stub found in Dubois' hand? Maigret tucked the fragment into his notebook, his mind already racing back to the café, to the ticket stub's lingering mystery. Paris was the fulcrum, a destination tying Dubois to Elise in a way he hadn't fully grasped until now. The pattern was stirring, faint but forming, hidden in plain sight beneath layers of misdirection. Back at the café, the early morning crowd was sparse, Madame Claire moving mechanically behind the counter, her face drawn with worry, or perhaps guilt. Maigret settled at his usual table by the window, ordering a coffee to anchor himself as he spread his notebook open, the ticket stub and receipt fragment side by side. He reviewed every detail, every conversation, searching for the overlooked link. The 1898 mill accident tied Dubois, Claire, and Monsieur Lambert in a web of unresolved history, a motive rooted in guilt or revenge. The stolen candlestick pointed to sabotage, a killer desperate to bury evidence. Elise's fear and disappearance hinted at a personal stake, a secret she couldn't or wouldn't reveal. But it was the mention of Paris, the consistent thread. Through the ticket stub, and now the receipt, that nagged at him most. Why Paris? Why had it rattled Elise so profoundly during his psychological gambit with the ledger? As he sipped his coffee, the river's ceaseless flow outside mirroring his thoughts, a memory surfaced, an offhand comment from the first night of the investigation, so casual he'd nearly dismissed it. Madame Claire, in her nervous recounting of the day Dubois died, had mentioned he'd seemed distracted lately, muttering about a trip, something about settling accounts. Maigret hadn't pressed her then, focused instead on the immediate crime scene, but now the words echoed, with new weight, settling accounts, a trip, Paris. He flipped through his notes, confirming the remark, and felt the pieces shift, a subtle click as the pattern began to emerge. Dubois hadn't just been planning a journey, he'd been preparing to resolve something, a debt, a confession, a confrontation tied to Paris. The ticket stub wasn't a random keepsake, but a symbol of intent, perhaps a final act that threatened someone in Montclair-sur-Loire. Elise's reaction to Paris, her disappearance shortly after, suggested she knew of this intent, perhaps was complicit or caught in its fallout. The receipt fragment by the river reinforced it. She'd either carried a similar clue or been targeted for what she knew. Maigret's gaze drifted to the café's interior, to Claire wiping the counter with forced calm, to Lambert's empty usual spot, and he realized the key had been in plain sight all along, not in dramatic revelations, but in the mundane, the muttered asides, the everyday habits of a small town hiding its past. He rose, approaching Madame Claire with a deliberate calmness, his voice low to avoid the ears of nearby patrons. "A question, madame," he began, watching her flinch slightly at his approach. "You mentioned Dubois muttering about a trip, settling accounts. Did he say where or with whom?" Her hands stilled on the rag she held, her eyes darting to the side before settling back on him with strained composure. I don't recall exactly, Inspector. It was just idle talk, you know, customers ramble. I think he mentioned Paris, but nothing specific." "Why?" Maigret nodded, not pressing further, though her hesitation spoke volumes. Paris again, the word a lightning rod for unease. The pattern solidified in his mind. Dubois' planned trip to Paris was the catalyst, a move to unearth or resolve something. Tied to the mill accident, perhaps a confession of negligence, a debt unpaid, or a secret long buried. Someone in this town connected to that 1898 tragedy had killed to prevent it, and Elise, knowing too much, had become the next target. The ticket stub, dismissed by Fournier as irrelevant, was the linchpin, a quiet detail overlooked until now, pointing to a motive of silencing the past before it could resurface in the present. As the morning stretched on, Maigret lit his pipe. At last, the tobacco's warmth grounding him amidst the rising clarity. The river outside flowed indifferent to the revelation, but inside the café felt smaller, the walls closing in with the weight of hidden truths. The pattern was there. Dubois' intent to travel to settle accounts had triggered a deadly response, and Elise's disappearance was the killer's next move to protect that secret. But who? Claire's nervousness, Lambert's defensiveness, or someone yet unseen manipulating events with chilling precision? Maigret's resolve hardened. The key had been staring at him from the start, woven into casual remarks and mundane clues. He would follow the Paris thread relentlessly now, digging into Dubois' connections there, tracing Elise's last hours with renewed focus. The killer believed chaos would shield them, but Maigret saw through the fog. The pattern had emerged, subtle but undeniable, and he was closer than ever to the heart of the crime. He puffed on his pipe, gazing at the river's ceaseless current, knowing the next step could unravel everything, or plunge the case into deeper darkness. The game was afoot, and he was ready to play it to the end. The midday sun cast a pale, watery light over Montclair-sur-Loire, filtering through the windows of the Riverside Café and illuminating the worn, checkered tablecloths where Inspector Jules Maigret sat. The river outside flowed with its eternal indifference, a quiet backdrop to the storm of clarity that had begun to coalesce in his mind. The pattern had emerged, Henri Dubois' planned trip to Paris, tied to settling accounts, was the catalyst for his murder, a secret so threatening that it led to Elise's disappearance as the killer sought to silence any loose ends. The ticket stub, the receipt fragment by the river, and Madame Claire's offhand remark about Dubois' intentions had been the overlooked keys, hiding in plain sight. Maigret's pipe rested unlit in his hand as he pored over his notebook, the fragments of the case knitting together, driving him toward the heart of the motive. He knew he was close, the truth shimmering just beneath the surface, waiting to be dragged into the light. Determined to follow the Paris thread, Maigret had spent the morning making discreet inquiries, telephoning contacts in the capital to trace any connections Dubois might have had there. A retired clerk at the Paris railway office, reached after persistent calls, confirmed that Dubois had purchased the ticket a week before his death, mentioning offhandedly to the ticket agent that he was tying up loose ends with an old friend. The phrase echoed Madame Claire's comment about settling accounts, reinforcing Maigret's hunch. Simultaneously, he pressed Sergeant Fournier to dig into Elise's background for ties to Paris, or the 1898 mill accident, while search parties continued combing the town for any sign of her. The tension in Montclair-sur-Loire was palpable, a quiet dread settling over the café as whispers of the missing waitress spread. It was just past noon when Fournier arrived at the café, his face grim but bearing news. "We've got something on Elise's family, Inspector," he said, sliding into the chair opposite Maigret with a thin folder in hand. Her mother, long deceased, worked at the mill back in the day, briefly before the accident in '98. No record of involvement in the incident itself, but she knew Dubois, Claire, and Lambert. Elise was born a few years after, grew up hearing stories, I'd wager. And here's the kicker. Her father, who left town when she was a child, was last known to be in Paris. No contact since, but it's a link. Maigret's grey eyes narrowed. As he absorbed the information, the pieces snapping into place with a chilling precision. Paris wasn't just a destination for Dubois, it was a nexus of buried secrets, a place where past sins might be confronted or exposed. Elise, tied to the mill through her mother and to Paris through her father, likely knew something, perhaps a family secret or overheard truth, that made her a threat. Maigret thanked Fournier, his mind already racing to the deeper implications. The motive wasn't just about silencing Dubois before he reached Paris. It was about protecting something far more profound, a truth so shattering that murder and abduction were acceptable prices to pay. He rose, pacing the cafe's length to the hallway where Dubois had died, his gaze lingering on the baseboard, where the blood smudge had been found. The 1898 mill accident, where Edouard Lambert perished under a collapsed beam amid whispers of negligence, loomed larger than ever. Maigret had suspected revenge or unresolved guilt, perhaps tied to Monsieur Lambert's loss of his brother or Claire's financial desperation. But now a darker possibility emerged. What if the accident hadn't been mere negligence, but a deliberate act, a cover-up so damning that its exposure even decades later would ruin lives? Dubois, a witness back then, might have been complicit, or recently burdened by guilt, ready to confess in Paris to someone tied to the past, perhaps Elise's father or another figure from the mill days. The ticket stub wasn't just a plan to flee, it was a declaration of intent to unearth a buried crime. The revelation of this hidden motive struck Maigret like a cold wind, far more shocking than the surface motives of greed or revenge he'd initially considered. It wasn't about money or petty grudges, it was about shame and survival, a desperate need to preserve a lie that had shaped lives for 30 years. The villain's psychology crystallized in his mind, a person so consumed by the fear of exposure, by the weight of a decades-old sin, that they would kill to keep it hidden. Murdering Dubois was an act of preservation, not just of reputation, but of their very identity, warped by guilt and the dread of judgment. Elise's disappearance, whether forced or fearful flight, was the inevitable next step. Anyone who might know, who might speak, became a target in this relentless drive to bury the truth. Maigret sat again, lighting his pipe at last, the tobacco's bitter warmth a counterpoint to the chill of understanding. He considered the suspects through this new lens. Monsieur Lambert, who lost his brother in the accident, might have orchestrated the original cover-up, killing Dubois to prevent a confession that would expose him as complicit, or worse, culpable. His defensiveness, his sharp dismissal of the past suggested a man haunted, not just by loss, but by what he'd done to conceal it. Madame Claire, tied to the mill and struggling now, could harbor the same secret, her financial desperation a mask for a deeper panic. If the truth came out, her role in any negligence or sabotage might destroy her beyond mere debt. Her over-eagerness to help, her nervous glances now read as terror of being uncovered. But it was the extent of the villain's actions, the precision of Dubois' murder in a locked hallway, the stolen candlestick to misdirect, the potential silencing of Elise, that revealed their psyche most clearly. This was someone who lived in constant shadow, their every choice since 1898 colored by the fear of that secret's weight. They had built a life on a foundation of lies, and the mere whisper of Dubois' intent to settle accounts in Paris was an existential threat, worth any extreme to neutralize. Maigret saw it now. A mind so fractured by guilt and dread that murder became not just a solution, but a necessity, a twisted act of self-preservation driven by the belief that exposure would be annihilation. As the afternoon deepened, the cafe's quiet hum around him felt heavier, the river outside a mirror to the dark current of human desperation he'd uncovered. Maigret knew the motive, protecting a secret from the mill accident, a cover-up of negligence or worse, was the heart of the case, more shocking than any surface crime because it exposed the raw, fragile underbelly of shame. But identifying the villain among Lambert, Claire, or an unseen player remained the final hurdle. He resolved to confront them one by one, using this newfound understanding to peel back their defenses, to watch for the flicker of recognition, when the mill's true history was laid bare. Maigret puffed on his pipe, his gaze fixed on the river's unending flow, the weight of the revealed motive settling over him. The killer had gone to unthinkable extremes, driven by a psychology warped by decades of hidden guilt, but Maigret was unrelenting. The truth of Dubois' death and Elise's fate was within reach, and he would drag it into the light, no matter how deep the shadows tried to cling. The final confrontation loomed, and he was ready to face the darkness at its core. The late afternoon cast a muted gold over Montclair-sur-Loire, the river outside the Riverside Café, catching the fading light in subtle glints as it wound through the town. Inside, Inspector Jules Maigret sat at his usual table by the window, the weight of the revealed motive, a desperate cover-up of a shameful secret from the 1898 mill accident, settling over him like a heavy fog. The true heart of Henri Dubois' murder wasn't greed or simple revenge, but a visceral need to protect a decades-old lie, a truth so damning that it had driven the killer to silence Dubois before he could confess in Paris, and to eliminate any threat, including the missing Elise. Maigret's pipe lay unlit on the table, his notebook open before him, every scribbled detail now aligned in a chilling mosaic. He knew the psychology of the villain, a mind fractured by guilt and fear of exposure, but identifying them among Madame Claire, Monsieur Lambert, or an unseen player required a final, decisive move. The tension coiled tight within him, though. His weathered face betrayed nothing. The time for the final confrontation had come. Maigret had spent the hours since his revelation crafting a plan, a subtle trap designed to force the killer's hand without tipping his own. He'd arranged, through Sergeant Fournier, to summon the key suspects, Madame Claire and Monsieur Lambert, to the café under the guise of a routine update on Elise's disappearance, a pretext mundane enough to lower their guard. Pierre, still under suspicion but less central since the candlestick's theft, was excluded to narrow the focus. Maigret also instructed Fournier to station 2 discreet officers near the café's exits, a precaution against any desperate flight. The ticket stub to Paris, secured in his pocket, and the receipt fragment found by the river were his silent weapons, symbols of the truth he'd wield to pierce the killer's defenses. As the clock neared 5 p.m., the stage was set, the café's dwindling crowd providing just enough cover for a confrontation that felt both intimate and perilous. Madame Claire arrived first, her apron still tied from a long day behind the counter, her face etched with strain as she took a seat across from Maigret. "Any news on Elise?" she asked, her voice tight, though her eyes avoided his, with a practiced evasiveness. Moments later, Monsieur Lambert shuffled in, his wiry frame tense, his expression a mask of irritation as he settled at the adjacent table. "What's this about, Inspector?" he growled. "I've told you everything I know." Maigret offered a faint nod, his demeanor calm, almost paternal, as he folded his hands on the table, letting the silence stretch until it pressed against them like a physical weight. "I appreciate your time," he began at last, his voice low, carrying the quiet authority of a man who held all the cards. "We're close to finding Elise, I believe, and closer still to understanding why Henri Dubois died. But there's one piece left, a secret from long ago, tied to the mill accident of 1898. I know what it is, and I know why it led to murder." I'm giving one of you the chance to speak before I lay it bare." The air in the cafe thickened, the distant clink of cups and murmured chatter fading into irrelevance. Claire's hands twitched in her lap, her lips parting slightly as if to protest, then closing again. Lambert's jaw clenched, his weathered fingers tightening around the arm of his chair, his gaze boring into Maigret with a mix of defiance and dread. The inspector's eyes moved between them, reading every micro-expression, knowing the pressure of his words, coupled with the weight of their shared history, would crack one of them. He slid the ticket stub from his pocket, placing it on the table like a chess piece in a final gambit. "Dubois was going to Paris to confess," Maigret continued, his tone steady, unrelenting, "to reveal what really happened at the mill, negligence perhaps, or sabotage. Someone here couldn't let that happen." "Who was it?" Claire's face drained of colour, her breath hitching audibly, but it was Lambert who snapped first, his voice a harsh rasp as he leaned forward.
"You've got no proof of anything, Inspector. That accident was 30 years ago. Tragic, yes, but over. Dubois was a muttering old fool, and I had no reason to kill him over ancient history." His words were sharp, but Maigret caught the
tremor beneath them, the flicker of panic in his eyes at the mention of sabotage, a term he hadn't used before, a slip that betrayed insider knowledge. Maigret turned to Claire, his gaze piercing. "And you, madame? Your café teeters on ruin. But is that all you feared losing if Dubois spoke? You were there at the mill, too. Did you help cover it up, whatever it was, or did you do more?" Her hands shook now, gripping the edge
of the table, and she stammered, I didn't do anything. I was just a girl. I barely knew what happened. I swear, Inspector, I didn't hurt him."
The tension peaked, a taut wire ready to snap, and Maigret remained composed, his mind clear even as the suspects unravelled before him. He had all the pieces, the mill secret, the Paris confession, the desperate psychology of a killer protecting their shame, and he saw now where the fault line lay. Lambert's reaction, the specificity of sabotage, rang truer than Claire's panicked denials. Maigret leaned forward, his voice dropping lower, a scalpel cutting to the bone. "Monsieur Lambert, Edouard was your brother. His death wasn't an accident, was it? You tampered with the machinery, or knew who did, and buried it. Dubois was there, a witness who kept silent for years, until guilt drove him to speak. You couldn't risk that confession in Paris, so you struck in that hallway precise and unseen, and when Elise, who'd heard too much through family whispers, became a threat, you made her vanish too. Where is she?" Lambert's face contorted, a flash of raw fear and fury, and suddenly he lurched to his feet, his chair scraping back as if to bolt for the door. But Maigret had anticipated the move, and with a subtle nod, the hidden officers stepped forward from their posts near the exits blocking his path. "Don't make this harder," Maigret said, his tone still calm, almost weary, as he stood to face the old man. "It's over. Tell me where Elise is. If she's alive, there's still a chance to lessen the damage." Lambert froze, his shoulders sagging as the fight drained from him, cornered by the weight of Maigret's certainty and the officer's presence. His voice broke as he sank back into the chair, a confession spilling out in a ragged whisper.
I didn't mean for it to go this far. Edouard's death, it was my fault. A wager, a stupid risk with the machinery to cut corners. It collapsed, killed him. Dubois saw, agreed to stay quiet for a price, but lately he couldn't live.
With it, said he'd tell everything in Paris to some lawyer tied to Edouard's widow. I panicked. I followed him to the hallway, struck him with a heavy wrench I'd hidden, made it look impossible. And Elise, she'd heard stories from her mother, started asking questions after Dubois died. I didn't kill her. I locked her in my cellar, shed by the river, to scare her into silence. She's alive, I swear. Maigray's face remained impassive, though relief flickered briefly at the news of Elise's survival. He signalled Fournier, who'd been watching from the counter, to send men to the shed immediately. The tension in the café lingered, sharp and raw, as Lambert sat defeated, his confession stripping bare the desperate psychology Maigret had unravelled, a man so consumed by shame and fear of exposure that murder became his shield. Claire, trembling, looked away, her own secrets perhaps lesser, but still heavy. Maigret lit his pipe at last, the tobacco's bitterness grounding him as he gazed out at the river's ceaseless flow. The final confrontation had played out, the trap sprung with quiet precision, and all the pieces, Dubois' death, the mill's secret, Elise's fate, had fallen into place. The killer was caught, the truth exposed, but the weight of human frailty lingered. He watched the river, knowing the case was closed, yet sensing the shadows of Montclair-sur-Loire would never fully lift. His work was done, and with a final puff of smoke, he prepared to step away from the darkness, if only for a moment, before the next call to unravel another impossible puzzle. The dusk settled over Montclair-sur-Loire with a quiet inevitability, the river outside the Riverside Café, reflecting the last embers of daylight as they faded into a bruised twilight. Inside, Inspector Jules Maigret sat at his familiar table by the window, the bitter curl of smoke from his pipe rising slowly into the still air. The final confrontation with Monsieur Lambert had unfolded with tense precision, his confession, peeling back the layers of Henri Dubois' murder, a desperate act to bury the truth of the 1898 mill accident, a rigged machinery failure that cost his brother Edouard's life. Lambert's admission of locking Elise in his cellar shed by the river had sent Sergeant Fournier's men racing to retrieve her, and word had just come back via a breathless officer. She was alive, shaken but unharmed, confirming the old man's account. The case seemed resolved, the killer's motive and actions laid bare. And yet Maigret's weathered face betrayed a lingering unease. As he stared at the river's ceaseless flow, a nagging doubt tugged at the edges of his mind, a whisper that the puzzle wasn't as complete as it appeared. Fournier approached the table, his expression a mix of relief and exhaustion, paperwork already piling up back at the station to formalize Lambert's arrest. "We got him, Inspector," he said, sliding into the opposite chair with a weary grunt. "Elise is safe. She's giving a statement now, confirming she overheard Lambert muttering about Dubois' Paris plans and confronted him out of curiosity. That's when he panicked and locked her up. It matches his story. We're done here, aren't we? Open and shut." Maigret nodded slowly, puffing on his pipe, but his grey eyes remained fixed on the river, distant and contemplative. "Perhaps," he murmured, his voice low, almost to himself. "But something feels unfinished. Lambert's confession fits. Yes, the motive, the opportunity. Yet the precision of the crime, the locked hallway, the staged impossibility, the stolen candlestick, feels beyond a man of his age and temperament. Panic drove him to silence Elise, but the murder of Dubois. It was calculated, almost theatrical. I wonder if we've seen the whole chessboard." Fournier frowned, shifting uncomfortably, but before he could protest, the café door creaked open, and Elise herself entered, escorted by a young officer. Her face was pale, her apron absent, her hands trembling slightly as she approached Maigret's table at his beckoning nod. "Mademoiselle," he greeted gently, gesturing to a seat. "I'm glad you're safe. I have a few last questions, if you're up to it, about what you heard, what you knew, before Lambert took you. Elise sat, her gaze darting nervously around the near-empty café, Madame Claire watching from the counter with strained curiosity. I told the officers most of it, she began, her voice fragile but steadying. I overheard Monsieur Lambert arguing with Dubois a few days before he died. It was late, after closing, near the hallway.
Lambert was angry, saying something about keeping the past buried and Paris will ruin us. I didn't think much of it then, just old men bickering. But after Dubois was killed, I remembered. I asked Lambert about it, just casually.
The day I disappeared. That's when he grabbed me, dragged me to his shed by the river. He said I'd ruin everything if I talked. Maigret listened, his face impassive, though his mind latched onto her words with predatory focus. Paris will ruin us, she'd said, quoting Lambert. Us, not me, not singular. A small, seemingly insignificant slip, but to Maigret it was a crack in the facade, a glimpse of a broader truth. He leaned forward slightly, his tone still gentle, but probing. Did Lambert mention anyone else during that argument? Or in the shed when he spoke to you? Anyone he might have been protecting or working with? Elise hesitated, her fingers twisting together, then nodded slowly. In the shed, he muttered something once, when he thought I couldn't hear. He said, Claire won't forgive me if this gets out. I thought it was just nonsense, him rambling under stress, but he sounded scared of her. Not just for himself, but like she had a stake in it too. The words landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading through Maigret's carefully constructed resolution. Madame Claire. Her name, tied to Lambert's fear, shifted everything in an instant. Maigret's gaze flicked to the counter, where Claire stood, frozen mid-motion, a rag in her hand, her face suddenly ashen as she realized the conversation had turned toward her. The last-minute twist emerged with chilling clarity. Lambert wasn't the mastermind, or at least not alone. Claire, struggling with debt, tied to the mill accident, had seemed a peripheral figure, her nervousness chalked up to financial woe or minor guilt. But now Maigret saw the deeper game. Her role wasn't passive. She was the shadow behind Lambert, the one whose desperation and cunning had orchestrated the murder's precision, using Lambert's brute fear as her tool. He rose slowly, his heavy overcoat draped over the chair, and approached Claire with a deliberate calm, his mind racing to reassemble the puzzle.
Madame Claire, he said, his voice low, cutting through the cafe's silence like a blade. Lambert spoke of your involvement, or your stake in keeping the mill's secret buried. Paris will ruin us, he said, and he feared your reaction.
If it surfaced. You were at the mill in '98 as a young woman, perhaps complicit in the cover-up of Edouard's death, but more than that, I think you planned Dubois' murder, down to the locked hallway, the impossible setup to stop his confession in Paris. You guided Lambert, didn't you?
Used his guilt to make him strike while you pulled the strings. Claire's hands dropped the rag, her eyes wide with a fear that bordered on terror. But she didn't flee. She stood rooted, her voice a strained whisper. Inspector, I didn't kill anyone, I swear. I knew about the mill, yes. Knew it wasn't just an accident. I helped hide it. False logs, lies to the inspectors, because we'd all lose everything if it came out.
When Dubois started talking about Paris, about confessing, I begged Lambert to stop him. I didn't mean murder. I thought he'd just scare him off. I didn't know he'd go that far until it was done. Maigret's gaze didn't waver, reading the half-truths in her trembling words. She hadn't wielded the wrench, perhaps, but her desperation had set the stage, her cunning shaping the crime's meticulous facade, the stolen candlestick, the misdirection, while Lambert acted as her unwitting weapon. The real mastermind wasn't the broken old man in custody, but the woman before him, whose quiet panic had hidden a ruthless will to survive. His genius was tested one last time, piecing together her role in the twilight of the case, recognizing that without her, Lambert would never have acted with such precision. He signaled Fournier, who'd overheard the exchange, to detain Claire for questioning, his tone remaining steady. "We'll sort the details at the station, madam. But the truth is out now. The mill's secret ruined more than Edward. It twisted you both into this." Claire's shoulders slumped, defeat etched in every line of her face, as the officer guided her away. Maigret returned to his table, lighting his pipe once more, the tobacco's warmth a faint comfort against the chill of the final revelation. The river flowed on outside, indifferent to the last twist that had shaken the case from its seeming closure. Lambert had struck the blow, but Claire was the architect, her fear of exposure forging a deadly plan. The investigation wasn't as open and shut as it appeared. It was a dual confession, a shared guilt rooted in a 30-year lie. Maigret's mind, tested to its limits, had unraveled the hidden hand just when resolution seemed certain. He watched the twilight deepen over Montclair-sur-Loire, knowing the darkness of human nature would always surprise, even at the end, and steeled himself for whatever shadow might call him next. The twilight deepened over Montclair-sur-Loire, wrapping the town in a quiet shroud as the last light bled from the sky and cast the river outside the Riverside Café in sombre hues. Inside, Inspector Jules Maigret remained at his table by the window, the faint glow of a nearby lamp illuminating the worn pages of his notebook and the curl of smoke from his pipe. The last-minute twist had unravelled the final layer of Henri Dubois' murder. Monsieur Lambert had delivered the fatal blow, driven by guilt and fear over the 1898 mill accident that killed his brother Edouard. But Madame Claire had been the true architect, her desperation and cunning crafting the crime's meticulous facade to prevent Dubois' confession in Paris. Both now faced justice, detained at the local station, Lambert for the act, Claire for her complicity and manipulation. Elise, shaken but safe after her ordeal in Lambert's shed, had provided the pivotal clue that exposed Claire's role. The case seemed closed, the truth fully revealed, yet Maigret's weathered face carried a trace of solemnity as he gazed at the river's ceaseless flow, reflecting on the resolution and the hidden clues that had nearly slipped past even him. Sergeant Fournier returned to the café after processing the initial statements at the station, his broad frame sagging with fatigue as he settled opposite. Maigret, with a steaming cup of coffee, requisitioned from the counter. "It's done, Inspector," he said, his voice rough from hours of shouting orders and scribbling reports. Lambert's confession holds. Full admission to striking Dubois with the wrench in the locked hallway, staging it as an impossible crime to baffle us. Claire's talking too, admitting she pushed him to act, planned the misdirection with the candlestick, even orchestrated its theft from evidence to keep us chasing tails. They're both charged, murder and conspiracy. Elise is with her aunt now, recovering. Seems like justice is served. You've done it again. He managed a tired half-smile, but Maigret's expression remained distant, his grey eyes fixed on the darkening water outside. "Yes, justice," Maigret murmured, puffing slowly on his pipe, the tobacco's bitterness grounding him. "But it's a heavy kind, isn't it? 2 lives unravelled by a secret 30 years old, and Dubois' blood on their hands because
of it. I'm glad Elise is safe, but there's no triumph in exposing such brokenness." He paused, then added, almost to himself, "And I nearly missed the deeper game." Claire's hand was subtle, hidden behind Lambert's louder guilt.
Fournier leaned forward, curiosity cutting through his exhaustion. "Missed. You caught them both, Inspector. Dug out a motive even I couldn't see past a bar fight or petty grudge. What clues did we overlook that you pieced together at the
End? Maigret set his pipe down, flipping through his notebook with deliberate slowness, as if retracing his own steps through the fog of the case.
They were there all along, Fournier, quiet things I almost dismissed as mundane. First, the ticket stub to Paris, found in Dubois' hand. You saw it as irrelevant, a quirk of a dead man's pocket, but I kept circling it. Why Paris? Why? Then, it was the key, a symbol of his intent to confess, to settle accounts, as Claire let slip early on. That phrase, muttered in passing, was a whisper of motive I didn't weigh enough at first. It pointed to a past so damning it warranted murder. He tapped a page in his notes, his voice measured, methodical. Then there was Elise's reaction when I staged the ledger gambit mentioning Paris. Her fear, it wasn't just nerves. It betrayed knowledge, a connection through her mother to the mill and through her vanished father to Paris. I should have pressed her sooner, though her disappearance forced the issue. And the receipt fragment by the river, matching the ticket's date, it tied her to Dubois' plan, a clue I nearly walked past, thinking it mere litter. These were threads of intent, of desperation, hiding in plain sight. Maigret's gaze shifted to the now empty counter where Claire had stood, orchestrating her facade. But the true oversight was Claire herself. I saw her strain, her financial ruin, as peripheral, a woman caught in circumstance. Her nervous tics, her over-eagerness to help, I read them as guilt over minor secrets, not as the moves of a chess master. It was Elise's recollection of Lambert's fear. Claire won't forgive me if this gets out. That flipped the board. Us, not me. A partnership, a shared stake. Claire's mind shaped the locked hallway ruse, the stolen candlestick misdirection, details too precise for Lambert's raw panic. I was one step behind her until that final word. Fournier nodded slowly, awe flickering in his tired eyes. You saw through it, though. Always one step ahead of us, Inspector. Those clues, stub, mutterings, a girl's flinch, most would have shrugged them off. How'd you know to keep digging? Maigret offered a faint, weary smile, his fingers tracing the edge of the ticket stub still on the table. Because people lie, Fournier, but their truths leak in the small things, the offhand word, the unconscious gesture. I listen for the discord, the note that doesn't fit. Claire and Lambert built a wall of misdirection, but walls have cracks.
If you look long enough, I've learned to trust the quiet over the clamour.
The café had emptied now, save for a lone waiter clearing distant tables, and the river outside shimmered under early starlight, its indifference a mirror to Maigret's reflective mood. Justice was served. Lambert and Claire would face the consequences of their shared crime, their lives shattered by the weight of a 30-year lie. Dubois' murder was avenged in the eyes of the law, and Elise's safe return softened the tragedy's edge. Yet Maigret felt no victory, only the somber weight of human frailty, of secrets that twisted souls into darkness. There was no escape for the villains this time. The station held them, and the courts would decide their fate. But the case left an echo, a reminder that justice, while delivered, rarely healed the wounds it uncovered. He rose, slipping on his heavy overcoat, his pipe tucked into his pocket, as he prepared to depart Montclair-sur-Loire. Fournier stood too, offering a respectful nod. "Heading back to Paris, then?" he asked. Another case waiting, I'm sure. Maigret glanced at the river one last time, its dark current a silent witness to the town's buried shadows. Soon enough, he replied, his voice low. There's always another puzzle, another hidden clue waiting to be seen. But for tonight, I'll let this one rest. He tipped his hat slightly, stepping into the cool night air. The case closed. Behind him, though the weight of its truths lingered in his steady gait, his genius had prevailed, unearthing the mist whispers of motive and complicity, proving once again why he remained a step ahead, not through flair, but through the quiet, relentless pursuit of the human heart's hidden corners. As he walked along the river path, the town fading into stillness, he knew the next mystery would call soon, and he would answer, as he always did, with patience and piercing clarity. The night had fully claimed Montclair-sur-Loire, the air crisp with the bite of approaching winter, as Inspector Jules Maigret walked slowly along the river path, the Riverside Café receding into the quiet darkness behind him. The river itself shimmered faintly under the pale glow of sparse street lamps, its ceaseless murmur a soft echo to the thoughts turning in his mind. Justice had been served, Henri Dubois' murder solved, with Monsieur Lambert confessing to the fatal strike, and Madame Claire unmasked as the cunning architect of the crime, both driven by a desperate need to bury the truth of the 1898 mill accident. Elise was safe, her harrowing hours in Lambert's shed now a fading nightmare, and the hidden clues, the ticket stub to Paris, the muttered fears, the subtle cracks in facades, had been pieced together by Maigret's relentless patience. His heavy overcoat hung on his shoulders, his pipe tucked away, and yet as he moved through the stillness of the small town, a faint restlessness lingered, a whisper of unfinished business beneath the surface of the closed case. He had bid farewell. To Sergeant Fournier at the café, the local officer's weary gratitude a testament to the resolution Maigret had brought to a tangled web of guilt and deception. The paperwork was done, the suspects detained at the station awaiting transfer to face formal charges, and Maigret's train back to Paris was set for the early morning. By all accounts, the case of the impossible crime in the locked hallway was over, the motives and machinations exposed under his steady gaze. Yet, as his boots crunched softly on the gravel path, the weight of a lingering question nagged at him, a minor detail that refused to settle neatly into the completed puzzle. It was nothing overt, nothing that would reopen the investigation, but enough to keep his mind from fully releasing Montclair-sur-Loire into the past. It was the matter of the receipt fragment, the torn piece of paper he'd found by the river on the path Elise had last walked. Dated for the day after Dubois' murder, stamped with the logo of a Paris-bound train line, it mirrored the ticket stub clutched in the victim's hand, a clue that had tied Elise to Dubois' intent and hinted at her knowledge of his plans. Maigret had assumed it was hers, dropped in haste during her abduction by Lambert, or perhaps planted as a taunt by the killers. But now, in the quiet of the night, a doubt crept in. Elise, in her statement, had never mentioned purchasing or
carrying such a receipt.
She'd admitted to overhearing Lambert and Dubois argue about Paris, but her own connection to the city, through a father long gone, remained vague, unconfirmed. If the fragment wasn't hers, whose was it? And why had it appeared there, on a path tied to her disappearance, yet seemingly unrelated to Lambert's or Claire's direct actions? Maigret paused by the river's edge, gazing down at the dark current as if it might offer an answer. He patted his coat pocket where his notebook rested, the fragment still tucked between its pages. It was a trivial loose end in the grand scheme. The case was solved, the killers caught, the motive clear, but Maigret's instinct, honed by decades of unraveling human mysteries, prickled at the anomaly. Had someone else been involved, a silent observer or peripheral player who'd dropped this clue either by accident or design? Or was it a remnant of Dubois himself, somehow misplaced in the chaos of his final days, carried to the river by chance, or an unseen hand? The question hung unanswered, a faint discord in the otherwise resolved symphony of the investigation, and though it didn't threaten the outcome, it left a shadow of curiosity in Maigrè's mind. He resumed his walk, the town's slumbering silhouette unfolding around him, and his thoughts drifted to the broader nature of mysteries. This case, like so many before, had revealed the depths of human desperation. Lambert's raw guilt, Claire's calculated fear, but it also reminded him that no puzzle was ever entirely complete. There were always threads left dangling, questions that lingered beyond the gavel's fall. As he neared the small inn where he'd taken a room during his stay, a figure stepped from the doorway. A young postman, bundled in a scarf against the chill, holding out a small, plain envelope. "Inspector Maigret?" the boy asked, voice hesitant. "This came for you just now, marked urgent." "No sender listed." Maigret took the envelope with a nod of thanks, his fingers tracing its edges as the postman hurried off into the night. Under the dim light of the inn's exterior lamp, he opened it carefully, revealing a single sheet of paper, folded once, with a brief, handwritten message scrawled in a hurried, jagged script. "Not all accounts are settled, Inspector. Look, to Paris if you seek the final piece." A watcher. No signature, no identifiable mark. Just those cryptic lines that sent a subtle chill down his spine, though his expression remained impassive. He tucked the note into his pocket alongside, the receipt fragment, his mind already turning over its implications. A taunt? A warning? Or a genuine hint at something or someone still lurking in the shadow of the mill accident, tied to Dubois' intended confession in Paris? The message echoed the unresolved echo of the receipt, suggesting a broader web, perhaps a figure, beyond Lambert and Claire who had watched the drama unfold, or even influenced it from afar. Maigret knew he couldn't pursue it now. His time in Montclair-sur-Loire was done, the case officially closed, and Paris awaited with its own demands. But the cryptic words planted a seed of intrigue, a promise of another chapter yet unwritten. Inside, the inn. He settled into his modest room, the faint creak of the building, a counterpoint to the river's distant murmur. He lit his pipe at last, the tobacco's bitter warmth steadying him as he gazed out the small window at the sleeping town. The mystery of Dubois' death was solved, justice delivered with Lambert and Claire in custody, and yet the lingering question of the receipt fragment and the anonymous note left a quiet itch, a reminder that a detective's work was a continuum, an endless unraveling of human secrets. He felt satisfied. Lives had been accounted for, a brutal truth exposed, but the curiosity lingered, a subtle hook ensuring the mind never fully rested. Maigret exhaled a slow plume of smoke, watching it dissipate into the dim air. The minor detail didn't diminish the resolution, it enriched it, a whisper that life's puzzles were never fully solved, that another mystery always loomed on the horizon. He would return to Paris, to the familiar clamour of the city, carrying the weight of this case and the faint promise of the note's challenge. Perhaps in time he'd look to Paris as the message urged, seeking the final piece of a story he thought had ended. For now, though, he let the night claim him, resting in the knowledge that his genius for the hidden would be called upon again, that a mystery never truly ends. As he prepared for sleep, the river flowed on outside, a timeless witness to the unresolved whispers interwoven with the town's shadows. Maigret closed his eyes. The weight of his overcoat hung by the door, ready for the morning train and whatever enigma awaited next. The case was closed, the audience of his own mind left content, yet intrigued, hooked by the quiet promise of another chase, another impossible truth to uncover in the endless dance of detection.